The dust never settled in Cedar Ridge. It hung in the air like unspoken grief, coating everything in a fine layer of amber grit that matched the perpetual twilight of Emma's world. She walked down Main Street as she had every Tuesday for 3 months now, her worn boots making soft impressions in the dirt, her head bowed against more than just the desert wind. The townspeople had stopped staring weeks ago. At first, they'd whispered behind gloved hands and lace curtains about the young widow who'd arrived on the morning stage with nothing but a carpet bag and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to see sunlight. Now she was simply part of Cedar Ridge's landscape, like the weathered hitching posts and the faded paint on Murphy's general store. Emma kept her gaze fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet as she made her way to the post office. There would be no letters waiting for her. There never were. But the routine gave her somewhere to go, something to do with the endless hours that stretched before her like the unforgiving desert horizon. She didn't notice the man sitting on the bench outside Henley's saloon until she was almost past him. Something, perhaps the unusual stillness of his posture, made her glance up for just a moment. Their eyes met. It lasted no more than a heartbeat, but in that instant, Emma felt something shift in her chest. The man wasn't looking at her the way others did, with pity, curiosity, or the careful politeness reserved for broken things. His dark eyes held a recognition that went deeper than sight, a knowing that made her breath catch. She looked away quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and hurried toward the post office. But she could feel his gaze following her, not intrusive or uncomfortable, but understanding. As if he'd seen past the careful mask she wore and recognized the weight she carried. Behind her, James Crawford remained on the bench, his calloused hands resting on his knees. He'd been sitting there for the better part of an hour, watching the town move around him without really seeing any of it. Until he knew that walk. The way she held her shoulders just a little too straight, fighting against an invisible burden. The careful distance she maintained from everyone around her. The way she moved through the world like she was trying not to disturb it, as if her very presence might somehow cause more damage. He'd walked that same way for 2 years after Sarah and little Matthew had died of the fever. Still walked that way, if he was being honest with himself. James stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. At 34, he felt decades older, carved hollow by loss and worn smooth by grief. He watched Emma disappear into the post office, noting the precise way she closed the door behind her. Not a slam, not a gentle pull, but something carefully controlled. The desert wind picked up, sending a tumbleweed rolling down the street like nature's own broken thing, and James found himself thinking about the woman's eyes. Brown, he thought, dark brown, like creek water in shadow. But it wasn't their color that had stopped his breath. It was the depth of pain he'd seen there, familiar as his own reflection. When Emma emerged from the post office minutes later, empty-handed as expected, she was careful not to look toward the saloon. But she could feel his presence like warmth from a distant fire, and despite herself, her step slowed slightly as she passed. "Ma'am?" The single word was spoken quietly, respectfully. Not a call for attention, but an acknowledgement. Emma stopped, her hand tightening on her small purse. "Sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word she'd spoken to anyone in Cedar Ridge beyond the basic necessities of daily life. James tipped his hat. A simple gesture, nothing more. But in it, Emma heard what he didn't say. "I see you, I see your pain. You're not as alone as you think." She nodded once, a tiny movement that somehow conveyed her own unspoken response. "I see you too." Then she continued walking, and James returned to his bench, both of them carrying something new in the silence, a connection as fragile and unexpected as a desert flower blooming after rain. As the sun began its descent behind the mesa, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold, Emma sat in her small rented room above the seamstress shop. For the first time in months, she found herself thinking about something other than the crushing weight of tomorrow. She thought about dark eyes that had seen too much, about the way someone could say everything without speaking at all. And 3 blocks away, James sat on his porch, whittling a piece of pine that would become nothing in particular. But for the first time since he'd buried his family, he wasn't whittling to keep his hands busy and his mind empty. He was whittling because he wanted to. Because something in a brief exchange of glances had reminded him that feeling wasn't always agony, that recognition wasn't always loss. Neither of them slept easily that night, but for once it wasn't entirely because of the ghosts they carried. Thursday brought one of those crystalline mornings that made the desert look like it was carved from light itself. Emma woke before dawn, as she had every day since arriving in Cedar Ridge, but today she lingered by her small window longer than usual, watching the town emerge from shadow. She told herself she wasn't looking for him. When she finally made her way downstairs, Mrs. Kowalski was already at her sewing machine, the rhythmic sound filling the small shop with purposeful noise. "You're up early again, dear," the older woman said without looking up from her work, though I suppose early doesn't mean much when sleep won't come anyway. Emma paused in the doorway. Mrs. Kowalski rarely spoke to her directly, respecting the invisible boundaries Emma had built around herself, but there was something different in her tone today. Gentler, perhaps, or more knowing. "I thought I might walk to the creek today," Emma said, surprising herself with the words. She hadn't planned to say anything at all. Mrs. Kowalski's hands stilled on the fabric. "Cedar Creek's a peaceful place, good for thinking. Though you might see James Crawford out there. He goes most mornings to check on his horses." The casual mention of his name sent a small jolt through Emma's chest. She'd spent half the night wondering if she'd imagined the moment between them, if her lonely mind had created meaning where none existed. "I don't mind," Emma said quietly. Mrs. Kowalski smiled at her sewing. "No, I don't suppose you would." The walk to the creek took Emma past the edge of town, where the rigid lines of civilization gave way to the organic curves of the desert landscape. She'd discovered this path her first week in Cedar Ridge, but had never ventured far along it. Today, something pulled her forward. She heard the horses before she saw them, the soft snuffling and occasional stamp of hooves on packed earth. Around a bend in the creek, a small natural meadow opened up, and there they were, 3 horses grazing peacefully in the morning light, their coats gleaming like polished wood. And there was James, standing beside a black mare, running his hands along her neck with the kind of gentle attention that spoke of real affection. He looked up when he heard Emma's footsteps, but there was no surprise in his expression, as if he'd been expecting her. "Morning," he said simply. "Good morning," Emma replied, then found herself adding, "They're beautiful." "This here's Midnight," James said, patting the mare's neck. "The bay gelding is Thunder, and the chestnut is Luna. They're about the only family I've got left." The honesty in his words was like a door being opened just a crack, and Emma found herself stepping closer. "You raised them?" "Thunder and Luna, yes. Found Midnight half dead 3 years ago, nursed her back." He paused, his hand stilling on the horse's mane. "Sometimes the broken ones make the best companions, once they heal." Emma felt the words settle somewhere deep in her chest. She reached out tentatively, letting Midnight catch her scent before gently touching the horse's nose. The mare's breath was warm against her palm, and for a moment Emma felt something she'd almost forgotten, the simple pleasure of connecting with another living thing. "She likes you," James observed. "How can you tell?" "The way she's standing. Horses know things about people. They can sense—" He searched for the words, "the weight folks carry." Emma's hand stilled on Midnight's nose. "And what does she sense about me?" James was quiet for a long moment, studying Emma's profile as she focused on the horse. "Grief," he said finally, "but also strength. She wouldn't have approached you if she sensed danger or bitterness. Horses, they can tell the difference between someone who's been broken and someone who's been destroyed." "Which one are you?" Emma asked, then immediately regretted the personal question, but James didn't seem offended. "Both, at different times," he said honestly. Destroyed comes first. Broken comes after, when you realize you're still breathing and might have to figure out what to do about it. Emma nodded slowly. I think I'm still in the destroyed part. That's honest. Most folks aren't that honest, even with themselves. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, both tending to the horses. Emma found herself naturally helping, holding Thunder steady while James checked his hooves, handing him brushes without being asked. It was the first time in months she'd done anything that felt remotely like living instead of just surviving. You lost someone, James said as they worked. It wasn't a question. My husband and our baby. The words came out flat, matter of fact, the way she'd learned to say them to keep from drowning. Cholera outbreak in Kansas City. James's hands paused in their work. I'm sorry. Your family? She asked because the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. My wife Sarah and our son Matthew. Fever took them both in the same week 2 winters ago. They continued grooming the horses, letting the simple, repetitive motions fill the space between words. There was something healing in the shared labor, in having someone who understood that some losses were too vast for comfort or advice. Do you ever wonder, Emma said eventually, why we're the ones left behind? Every day, James admitted, but I stopped trying to make sense of it. Some things just are, and fighting against them only makes the burden heavier. As the sun climbed higher, Emma realized she'd been at the creek for over an hour, the longest she'd spent anywhere besides her room since arriving in town. More importantly, she'd spoken more words to James than she'd said to anyone in months, and it hadn't felt like work. I should head back, she said reluctantly. Will you come again? James asked, then quickly added, the horses, they enjoyed the company. Emma almost smiled at that, the first time her facial muscles had even attempted the expression in months. I think I'd like that. As she walked back toward town, Emma felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. She wasn't healed, might never be fully healed, but for the first time since her world had ended, she could imagine that healing might be possible. Behind her, James watched her go, noting the way she held her head a little higher, the way her steps seemed less burdened. Midnight nuzzled his shoulder as if to say she approved, and James found himself looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way he hadn't in 2 years. Sometimes, he thought, the best medicine wasn't words or time or distance. Sometimes it was simply being seen and understood by someone who had walked through the same darkness and somehow found their way to a place where the sun still rose each day. The third time Emma came to the creek, she brought coffee. James was expecting her now, had been since dawn, though he wouldn't have admitted it to anyone. When he saw her approaching with a covered tin cup in each hand, something warm unfurled in his chest. Thought you might be getting thirsty, she said, offering him one of the cups. Her voice was stronger today, more present. That's mighty thoughtful, James replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. It was still hot, which meant she'd timed her walk perfectly. The realization that she'd been thinking about him, planning for his comfort, stirred something in him that he'd thought was buried forever. They settled on a fallen log beside the creek, the horses grazing nearby. The morning was cooler than usual, with clouds gathering on the western horizon. James had learned to read the desert sky like scripture, and this particular arrangement promised afternoon rain. Tell me about her, Emma said suddenly. Your wife. The question caught James off guard. In 2 years, no one had asked him about Sarah directly. People offered condolences, spoke around the loss, but no one had simply asked him to remember her out loud. Sarah she was like music, he said slowly, testing the words. Always humming while she worked, always moving like she was dancing to something only she could hear. She had this way of making even the hardest days feel lighter. He paused, surprised to find that talking about Sarah didn't hurt the way it used to. The pain was still there, but it was softer now, more like touching a healed scar than an open wound. She would have loved this, he said, gesturing to the peaceful scene around them. The horses, the creek, the quiet. She always said the best conversations happened in places where you could hear yourself think. Emma nodded, understanding. What about Matthew? 8 years old and convinced he was going to be the finest horse trainer in all of Texas. James's voice caught slightly. He had Sarah's music in him, but he wanted to channel it into working with animals. Used to follow me around, asking a million questions about everything. They sound wonderful, Emma said softly. They were. James looked at her then, seeing the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, as if drawing warmth from it. What about your husband? And the baby? Emma was quiet for so long that James thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Thomas was safe. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But he was the first person I'd ever met who made me feel like I could just be myself without having to prove I deserved to exist. She took a shaky breath. We'd been trying for a baby for 3 years. When I finally got pregnant, we were so happy, so grateful. How far along were you? James asked gently. 7 months. Far enough to have names picked out, to have built a cradle, to have hopes. Emma's voice broke on the last word. She was going to be Elizabeth Sarah, after my grandmother and his mother. We called her Lizzie. They sat in silence, each lost in their own memories. The creek bubbled softly beside them, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried, life continuing its ancient rhythms while they carried their grief like stones in their pockets. I keep thinking, Emma said eventually, that if I could just understand why it happened, I could accept it. But there's no why that makes sense. Good people die, babies die, the world just keeps going. The hardest thing for me, James said, was realizing that my grief didn't matter to the universe. The sun still rose, people still laughed. Life just continued, like nothing had changed, when everything had changed. Yes, Emma breathed. Exactly that. A raindrop landed on James's hand, then another. The promised storm was arriving ahead of schedule. Both of them looked up at the darkening sky, but neither moved to leave. We should probably head back, Emma said, but she made no move to stand. Probably, James agreed, also staying put. The rain began in earnest then, fat drops that sent the horses trotting toward the shelter of the cottonwood trees. Emma and James remained on their log, getting steadily wetter, and somehow it felt right. The rain was cool and clean, washing away the dust that seemed to coat everything in this desert country. I haven't cried, Emma said suddenly. Not once since it happened. People keep telling me I need to cry, that it would help, but I can't. It's like there's a dam inside me that won't break. James studied her profile, noting the tension in her jaw, the way she held herself so carefully controlled. Maybe the dam is the only thing keeping you standing right now. Maybe, she said, but I feel like I'm drowning anyway. Without thinking, James reached over and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were cold from the rain, and he could feel the fine trembling that ran through them. You're not drowning, he said firmly. You're here. You're breathing. You're talking about them, which means you're stronger than you think. Emma looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how natural it felt. How do you know? Because I've been where you are. The place where existing feels like an accomplishment and making it through each day is a victory. He squeezed her fingers gently. You're going to survive this, Emma. It's going to change you. It already has. But you're going to survive it. The rain intensified, soaking through their clothes and turning the creek into a rushing brown torrent. They should have been miserable, sitting there getting drenched. But instead, Emma felt something loosening in her chest. Not the dam, that was still firmly in place, but something else. The terrible isolation that had wrapped around her like chains since Thomas and Lizzie had died. I should go, she said, but didn't move her hand from under his. You should, James agreed, also not moving. They sat there for another 10 minutes, rain streaming down their faces, finding comfort in the simple human contact. When they finally stood to leave, Emma felt lighter somehow, as if the rain had washed away more than just dust. Tomorrow? James asked as they prepared to part ways. Tomorrow, Emma confirmed. As she walked back to town, her dress clinging to her legs and her hair plastered to her head, Emma realized she was looking forward to something for the first time in months. Not happiness. She wasn't ready for that yet, but anticipation. The knowledge that there would be someone waiting for her. Someone who understood the weight she carried and didn't expect her to set it down before she was ready. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the recognition that healing might be possible, and for now that was enough. 3 weeks later, the dam finally broke. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning that began like all the others had. Emma made her way to the creek with coffee for two, expecting to find James with the horses as always. Instead, she found him sitting on their usual log, head in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She set the coffee cups down carefully and sat beside him, close enough that he would know she was there, but far enough to give him space. She didn't speak, didn't touch him, just sat and waited while he grieved. "Today," he said eventually, his voice raw and broken, "would have been Matthew's 10th birthday." Emma felt her heart clench. She'd learned to read the calendar of James's grief in the past weeks, recognizing the days when the weight pressed heavier on his shoulders. But this was the first time she'd seen him completely undone. "Tell me about his birthdays," she said softly. James raised his head, his eyes red and lost. Sarah always made him a cake shaped like a horse, chocolate, with sugar flowers around the edges. And we'd take him to the county fair if there was one, or just into town to spend his birthday money. His voice caught. He'd save up all year to buy something special, usually something for the horses. Emma nodded, encouraging him to continue. Last year, his last birthday, he used all his money to buy a new brush for Thunder. Said the old one was too worn out to do a proper job. James laughed through his tears. Kid spent his whole birthday allowance on horse grooming supplies and acted like it was the best day of his life. "He sounds like he was an amazing boy," Emma said. "He was. He was everything good about me and Sarah, but better, kinder, more generous, more alive." James looked at her then, his face raw with pain. "Some days I think the world lost more when he died than when I was born. What kind of father thinks that about his own child?" "The kind who loved him completely," Emma said firmly. "James, the fact that you can see how special he was, that you can honor what the world lost, that's not wrong, that's love." They sat in the morning quiet, the horses moving peacefully around them, unaware of the human grief being carried in their presence. Emma found herself thinking about Lizzie, about the birthdays that would never come, the first words she'd never speak, the first steps she'd never take. "I think about her constantly," Emma said suddenly. "The baby. I think about who she would have been, what she would have looked like. Thomas had these beautiful green eyes, and I kept imagining her with his eyes and my stubborn chin." She paused, her breath coming faster. "I had all these plans, all these dreams about the mother I was going to be, the things I was going to teach her, the way I was going to love her. What would you have taught her first?" James asked gently. "To be brave," Emma said without hesitation. "Not fearless, fear keeps you alive, but brave. To speak up for herself, to take up space in the world, to believe she deserved good things." Her voice started to shake. "I wanted her to be everything I had to learn to be, instead of being born knowing it." "She would have been," James said with certainty. "Any child raised by you would have been brave and strong and sure of her place in the world." That's when it happened. The dam that had held for months suddenly cracked, then burst completely. Emma gasped as if she'd been hit, and then the tears came. Not gentle tears, but great wrenching sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her chest. She doubled over with the force of them, years of held grief pouring out all at once. James didn't hesitate. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping his arms around her shaking form, murmuring gentle words she couldn't understand, but didn't need to. She sobbed for Thomas, for Lizzie, for the life they'd planned that would never exist. She sobbed for James and Sarah and Matthew, for all the love in the world that had nowhere to go. She sobbed until she was empty, until there was nothing left but exhaustion and the steady rhythm of James's heartbeat against her ear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, when she could finally speak. "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize for grieving," James said firmly. "Don't ever apologize for that." They stayed that way for a long time, holding each other while the desert wind moved through the cottonwood trees and the horses grazed peacefully nearby. Emma felt hollowed out, but somehow lighter, as if the tears had carried away some weight she'd been carrying unknowingly. "What happens now?" she asked eventually. "Now we keep going," James said. "We honor the people we lost by living as fully as we can. We carry their love with us instead of just their absence." Emma pulled back to look at him, noting the way the morning light caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "Together? If you want," James said carefully. "I know this is complicated. We're both still grieving, still healing. But I'd like to try if you're willing. Not to replace what we lost, but to build something new alongside it." Emma thought about Thomas, about the way he'd loved her so generously, so completely. He'd wanted her to be happy, had told her so during those terrible final days when they both knew he was dying. She thought about Lizzie, about the kind of man she would have wanted for her mother, someone kind and patient and unafraid of the full range of human emotion. "I'd like that too," she said softly. James smiled then. The first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and more hopeful. "Good," he said. "That's really good." They spent the rest of the morning with the horses, working together in comfortable silence, both of them changed by what had passed between them. When it came time to leave, they walked back toward town together instead of parting at the creek. "James," Emma said as they reached the edge of the settlement. "Yes? Thank you. For seeing me, for understanding, for not trying to fix me." "Thank you for the same," he replied. "And Emma, you don't need fixing. You just needed time to remember that you're still here, still alive, still capable of love." As they parted ways in the center of town, Emma to her room above the seamstress shop, James to his small house on the outskirts, both of them carried something new. Not the absence of grief, that would always be part of them, but the presence of hope. The knowledge that love didn't die with the beloved but transformed, found new expressions, new recipients. That evening, as Emma sat by her window watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of rose and gold, she placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered to the daughter who would never be, "I'll always love you, Lizzie, and I think you'd like him. I think you'd want me to be happy." The desert wind carried her words away, and somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called to its mate, a sound both sad and hopeful, like the human heart learning to beat again after it thought it might have stopped forever. 3 blocks away, James sat on his porch with Thunder's new brush in his hands, the one Matthew had bought with his birthday money. "I found someone, son," he whispered to the gathering dusk. "Someone who understands about missing you. I think you'd like her. I think you'd want your old dad to be happy." And in the space between grief and healing, between memory and hope, 2 hearts that had been broken began the slow, careful work of learning to beat in rhythm with each other, not forgetting what they'd lost, but allowing what they'd found to matter just as much. Control is Due Chat Sonnet 4.